Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Struck. I am the Director of the Planning and Parks Department for Ozaukee County. And I'll also have Natalie from my office introduce herself quickly.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Natalie Abalone, and I'm the Senior Planner with Ozaukee County Planning and Parks.
Thanks, Stanley. So again, just as a reminder on some logistics here tonight, if you would please mute yourself for the presentation. We have a relatively small group this evening, so for the Q&A we can unmute, but you can also put questions in the chat, and Natalie will be monitoring that. So feel free to, if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll try and address them at the end of the presentation or get back to you. So again, as Natalie said, thank you very much for joining us. This is the first of many presentations and public meetings, hopefully, on the planning that we'll be doing for Clay Bluffs Cedar Gorge Nature Preserve. This one specifically is dealing with our community forest plan for the property, which we'll talk a little bit more about tonight. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation. And so this evening, our meeting outline looks like this. We'll talk a little bit about how we got here, some of the county planning goals and objectives that got us to this point, and the actual acquisition of the Clay Bluffs Cedar Gorge Nature Preserve. We'll talk a little bit about that background in the acquisition. Specifically tonight, we're going to focus on the U.S. Forest Service Community Forest Program and the Community Forest Plan that's required as part of that grant award and project area. We'll talk a little about those specific plan goals and objectives, next steps, and then certainly take any questions or comments that you have, both on the presentation tonight, and we'll talk to you about where you can see and review the full draft plan. So just in the way of a little bit of background on getting to this point, in 2010 and then again in 2020, the county conducted a countywide public opinion survey, really for not only priorities for park and open space uses, but really priorities across really all of our comprehensive planning goals and objectives. And the 2020 survey largely replicated the 2010 survey, and so we could largely compare some of the same questions. So what you see in this slide is just a summary of some of the top priorities for future funding that were identified as part of that survey. And in the parentheses after each one, you can see the percentage of respondents and in the given survey date, either 2010 or 2020. I just wanted to take a second to highlight those that are in yellow. Really been our focus and quite significant response to what the county's funding priorities should be, particularly as it relates to park and open space. So you can see preserving open space and protecting natural resources and wildlife habitat. 74% of respondents said that this was a high priority in 2010, and then it even increased to 85% in 2020. And you can see similar results for public access to rivers, streams, and lakes, including Lake Michigan in this case. Protecting natural areas adjacent to county parks, again, what we're going to learn a little bit more about today, and acquiring parkland for passive recreational uses. Excuse me. So with that public opinion survey, the county went on to refine and adopt its park and open space plan, and identified a one of 5 project areas. This one centered around Lions Den Gorge Nature Preserve, and hence called the Lions Den Gorge Nature Preserve project area. which you see on the map is outlined in white. That's a larger planning project area that the county identified as a priority. And based on the responses that we've received in the survey and other information. In this case, it identified actually the land that was now ultimately acquired as part of Clay Bluffs Cedar Gorge Nature Preserve. And you can see there kind of in dark gray, two areas. Those are natural areas that we'll talk more about, but excuse me, two natural areas identified in the red dotted area. That's Clay Bluffs Cedar Gorge Nature Preserve. Two natural areas that were protected as part of this acquisition. So the acquisition was a long process and conducted in partnership with the Ozaukee Washington Land Trust. The Land Trust was a key partner for acquiring the property. Excuse me, as well as numerous federal, state, and other local funding sources through grant awards and private donations. On the map shown on the screen, you can see the puzzle piece that was used to acquire Clay Bluffs Cedar Gorge Nature Preserve. Each one of those shaded areas is a different federal grant funding source that the county secured, ultimately to come up with just a little over half of the acquisition price, $2.6 million, is represented by those different federal funding grant sources. The property ultimately, the 134 acres shown here and outlined in white dotted line, was acquired in August of 2022. The land trust will hold a conservation easement on the entire property, all 134 acres, for protecting the natural values in perpetuity long into the future, and guide some of the work that we're talking about tonight as far as restorations and enhancements and passive recreational access. The Planning and Parks Department is currently working on a full master plan for the property that will guide needed restoration work, as well as I mentioned, the development of passive recreational amenities for the nature preserve. This master plan, as I mentioned, is going to incorporate the full 134 acres. This evening, though, we're going to be talking specifically about the area of the property that was funded in part by a $600,000 grant award through the U.S. Forest Service Community Forest Program grant award. It includes, as you see here in the map, the 42-acre area in light green that largely encompasses, other than the Cedar Gorge on the north end of the property, encompasses the largest area of wooded, largest area of forested area on the property. And the Forest Service grant award requires us to specifically plan for that community forest in the future, which includes public access and recreational opportunities, as well as protecting water supplies, water quality, wildlife habitat. As I mentioned, the area is largely focused on that southeast green shaded area, 42 acres. That's largely comprised of forested and wooded wetlands and shrub car wetlands. The property, the project area, excuse me, the Forest Service Community Forest Plan area also incorporates the Port Washington Clay Banks natural area of local significance. So this was identified through the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission's natural area plan, and a significant portion of the Lake Michigan shoreline. So I won't read all this. This is our guidance from the Forest Service regarding the final rule for what needs to be part of the community forest plan. And we've incorporated all of these and hope to get your input as well on the draft plan. But it generally talks about those items that are required to comply with the community forest plan. What I really wanted to talk about again is where we are in the current master planning process. And so you can see the current final draft master plan. The master plan will incorporate the community forest plan within. You can see that while the largest wooded area on the property is entirely within that 42-acre community forest plan area, there are both other existing wooded areas, namely the Cedar Gorge natural area to the north end of the property, and then also proposed restoration areas for woodland on the north end as well, and between the gorge and the southern 42-acre community forest plan area. The community forest plan, as I mentioned, will be part of the overall park master plan, which will be reviewed by the county's natural resource committee and then ultimately adopted by the county board as part of its park and open space planning effort. The master plan will also be incorporated into the conservation easement that will be held by the Ozaukee, Washington Land Trust. So if you have any comments as you either this evening or as you get a chance to review the final draft plan, we welcome that, and those will be provided to the Natural Resource Committee as well for to provide that input to them as they consider the plan and master plan updates and adoption. Not to go over too much detail in the overall master plan, but I did mention a few items about future restoration. So I realize there's a lot going on this map, but it talks about future restoration of the full 134 acres. It talks about enhancement to some of those existing qualities, like the area within the community forest plan, that existing woodland enhancement to both the woodland and the wetlands in that area. And then it also talks or shows conceptually where public access will be provided and how, through a network of trails, boardwalks, ultimately public access to Lake Michigan through the north end of the gorge. So just to briefly touch on those goals that we have for the community forest plan, I just wanted to touch on a few of those here. And while they are specific to the community forest plan area, many of these and probably all of these translate to goals that we have for the full 134 acre nature preserve property. And so those are protecting, enhancing, as I mentioned, in some cases where there's existing woodland and wetlands, and restoring the forest land, the clay seepage bluff, the coastal wetlands, and the natural Lake Michigan shoreline, and the associated unique and threatened natural habitat and diverse ecological communities that exist within. In particular, improving and restoring the ecological health of the property, but also fish and wildlife habitat for the property, which, as I mentioned, includes the Port Washington Clay Banks natural area, specifically within that community forest plan area, as well as important bird habitat, including habitat in this natural area for the short-eared owl. And of course, its proximity along Lake Michigan, a very important corridor and migratory bird flyway habitat. And we will be looking to improve and restore the qualities for those pieces of the property. Also prioritizing native vegetation restoration for many purposes, including managing erosion with the bluff, Also, conducting and managing invasive species on the property, both vegetative invasive species such as buckthorn, honeysuckle, other standard vegetation invasives that we deal with on an ongoing basis, as well as those that affect the vegetation. So emerald ash borer and the loss of our ash trees on the property. Creating habitat, high quality habitat for resident and migratory waterfowl, stormwater management, reduction of non-point source pollution to Lake Michigan, and that largely will be through restoration of the wetland areas, both in the community forest area and throughout the property. To open up year-round, to open up the property year-round for nature-based outdoor recreational opportunities, hiking, cross-country skiing, kayaking, canoeing, fishing, bird watching, wildlife observation, nature study, etc. And lastly, providing public access to nature-based outdoor recreation in this high-quality natural area to allow people to experience these unique habitats and the Lake Michigan shoreline while protecting the high-quality natural features that they have. And this is just a slide to show some of those existing community types, particularly in that community forest plan area. You can see we have wooded wetlands, ephemeral wetlands. We have kind of shrub carr, ephemeral wetlands, and then our Lake Michigan shoreline and the clay seepage bluffs that exist with some very unique vegetation. So just to further develop that point, our goals will include native forest restoration. This is specific to the Lake Michigan coastal forest and species that are native and relevant to the Lake Michigan coastal forest. So diverse planting of both species and age classes for the property, as well as I mentioned, invasive species management. And we will be working on both of these items in the very near future for the property, but starting to manage for emerald ash borer, which largely will be managing the ash trees on the property, which does not mean full removal. It remains will largely be guided by our emerald ash borer management plan, which means a prioritized removal of ash trees for safety purposes and recreational opportunities, but also can allow for some standing dead ash for habitat for birds and other wildlife. So largely focus on removal of hazardous trees. And then I also mentioned removal of some invasive woody species, but that will also include non-woody invasives and other challenges that we may face along the invasive species line as we move forward. One of the things I mentioned was important goal for us is restoration and enhancement of the community forest, and specifically those wooded wetlands, and enhancing those where we can, and restoring other wetlands for recharge of groundwater, management of stormwater, and reducing pollutant loads to both the community forest property area, the natural area, but also ultimately Lake Michigan. Working to store and sequester additional carbon dioxide and other air pollutants, kind of addressing climate change by increasing planting, tree planting throughout the property and within the natural area. Certainly enhancing wildlife habitat and specific to reptile and amphibian habitat on the property, which is in good condition, and we want to make sure that whatever we do will do no harm and enhance the quality habitat that's there. And in some cases, efforts to fully restore wetlands that previously existed that don't currently exist due to prior agricultural activities, et cetera. And you can see some of that, the 42 acres, the portions of it are within the farmland area, the non-wooded area, as frontage on County Highway C. So you can see in this map, it's showing existing wetlands and kind of the white dotted polygons, and the potentially restorable wetlands in the light shaded blue. And so our goal would be to restore many of those acres of potentially restorable wetlands with further planning and design. As I mentioned, this portion of the property, but the property as a whole, serves as key habitat for many migratory birds, many raptor species, particularly those using the Lake Michigan flyway and portions of the Great Lakes Mississippi Valley flyway. And also, the property is at a really unique juncture between two important bird areas, one being the Ozaukee Bight Lakeshore Migration Corridor, and the other, the Harrington Beach Lakeshore Migration Corridor. So enhancing habitat for those important bird areas. And also, as I mentioned, a species of special concern, the short-eared owl, which has been identified using the property and specifically this community forest program area acreage in the past. Switching gears slightly, but we also want to provide passive recreational use to the property and specifically within the community forest. So you can see some of the amenities that are planned here in the map, but specifically we anticipate recreational trails, either wood chipped or mowed. You can see kind of the network to provide connectivity both to the community forest property, the lakeshore, and then also access back out to the road. Boardwalks where we need them for crossing both existing and restored wetlands. And key overlook sites to enjoy the Lake Michigan shoreline and coast and the views that you have from the 110-foot high clay seepage bluffs. Also, recreational uses being hiking, bird watching, wildlife viewing, cross-country skiing, and I think very importantly, access to the Lake Michigan Water Trail, largely from the water side of the property, but also future access to Wisconsin's new designation for the Shipwreck Coast National Marine Sanctuary, which is off the shores not only of this property, but all the way up to Manitowoc. And so we hope to be a gateway for the new designation of the Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast. I won't read all the details, but this is showing kind of the timeline for the next 3 years anyway, as we look towards some of the immediate restoration and public access goals. Some of the things that have already begun, in fall of 2022, this year, we actually seeded all 80 acres of the marginal farmland on the property with annual rye cover crop to protect the soils and reduce introduction of invasive species. That included some areas within the 42-acre community forest area property. We've actually already submitted a few additional grants for both restoration and public access work. We have a pending grant with the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program. We have some existing funding as well as some pending funding for work that we've identified for the community forest, including several tree planting grants to, again, address the impact of emerald ash borer, as well as the removal of necessary hazard ash trees on the property. And also some additional grants to actually conduct some inventories for both the amount of ash that are on the property as well as those trees that we'll be planting. In 2023, some of the same things we'll look forward to. So hopefully with some success with some grant funding, we will hopefully start the process of addressing public access to the property and also restoration on the property. That will probably take the form of the southern acres and largely the property in and around the community forest. So that will include trail development, boardwalk development, but also importantly, start some of the restoration project with the wetlands and the forest in those areas. We will also in 2023 really gear up and start to both inventory and start to manage some of the invasive species that exist within the community forest area, and specifically those woody invasives, but we'll be inventorying all invasives. And then we'll continue in 2024 with some of our existing grant funding and hopefully future awarded funding for tree planting, particularly in the community forest program area. So with that, I welcome any questions that we can take tonight. We will be also posting this recorded session on our website, hopefully shortly after the presentation here. We welcome any comments. We're hoping to get comments by the end of the month, December 28th. So that we can relay any of those comments to the Natural Resource Committee. This will not be the last time for comments, though. These will be hopefully specifically towards the community forest plan, but we will continue to, as I mentioned, have additional public meetings on the master planning for the property. Shortly after the presentation here tonight, we will be posting the final draft of the community forest plan for you to download and review and read and comment on. So again, we'd appreciate any comments by December 28th. You can email those to myself and the email's on the screen, or to Natalie. And we also welcome any questions and comments this evening. Again, the full plan, draft plan should be posted by this coming Monday. We had hoped to have it posted for the meeting tonight, but as things will come up, we're trying to address some last comments to get that posted. So with that, I will just think, Natalie, were there any questions in the chat right away that we can address?
Yeah, we have a question. Well, it was just sent to me, but I think it would be good for everyone. There's a question about universal accessible trails or ADA accessible trails that right now are not shown on the conceptual site plan, but are planned for the site.
Yeah, great question. So to the extent practical, and while we're also protecting natural resources, we do anticipate having universally accessible trails on the property. It doesn't mean that all trails will be universally accessible, but we will be providing that type of accessibility as we have done with similar properties like Lions Den Gorge Nature Preserve. So we definitely are looking and to do that, and that is part of the plan.
We have a couple more questions coming in. So when do you anticipate allowing public access to the property? Are people able to walk the property now or not until the trails are established?
Yeah, another very good question. So right now, public access is still restricted, largely because there is not a safe network or public access to the property, and specifically, there isn't a good area for parking or even riding your bike to the property at this time. So one of our first goals that you may have saw in the master planning, one of our first goals is to provide a parking area that will allow access to the property, and then the initial development of that trail system. So we hope to start that development as soon as 2023. That is a little bit funding contingent. So I don't have a hard and fast answer for you, but we're actively looking to provide some public access to the property as soon as next year.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, the next question is wondering why it's called a community forest. Is it a community forest because trails will go through it? Is the other forested area to remain for animals and not for humans trail-wise?
A great question. And again, largely a function of the funding that we were awarded through the U.S. Forest Service, but their definition of the community forest includes both recreational access to the forest, as well as protection of the natural resource, as well as economic use of the resource. In this case, so that could mean, targeted harvesting of the forest product, but in this case, that will not be part of our community forest plan. There will be no forestry activity. That will also be clearly identified in our conservation easement for the property. So in this case, of the Forest Service's 3 identified areas for a community forest, recreation, sustainable economic use, and restoration of the natural resource, our plan largely focuses on the 2, restoration of the resource and that specifically that natural area, and providing recreational access. So that means the trail network. And yes, we do anticipate providing access through this portion of the property, which is probably one of the more challenging parts of the property to provide access because of the existing wetlands and the sensitive nature of the natural area. So we'll be taking good precautions and best practices to not only provide public access, but restore and enhance the natural area and the existing forest asset.
Yeah, and I just want to provide one clarifying point about the community forest. So the community forest is labeled as such because of the U.S. Forest Service grant funding that we got for this specific area, which within the larger nature preserve. So there will be trails going through the other forested sections of the property. They're just not going to be a part of the community forest plan as they aren't applicable to the U.S. Forest Service funding, if that makes sense. It's a little confusing.
I will also say, it was asked also, are there areas that are kind of set aside for wildlife and the habitat? Absolutely. So some of our conceptual planning to date has been providing sensitive public access to the property and reserving those areas that we can or that we best can protect for the wildlife habitat that they provide and the sensitive nature of the vegetation. So this is about providing some public access throughout the property, but also protecting and preserving some of the natural features that make it so special.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, we have some more questions. So the next one is wondering if the forested area within the community forest, if it's good quality, and will the tree planting be done within the forested area or outside of the area?
Great questions, really great questions. So the forested area does have some high quality woodland or forest components to it, both canopy and understory native vegetation and trees, shrubs. There is some challenges, of course. A good portion of the community forest property has been impacted by emerald ash borer, and there is a large percentage of ash trees. And so we are going to be looking at trying to reestablish that lost ash tree canopy. So I would say the area is very high quality. It has been identified as a natural area of local significance. There are many features that make it really good habitat. But one of the things that we're hoping to address right away and try and restore is the loss of ash tree and the ash tree canopy, particularly for those wooded wetlands, a threatened ecological community in Ozaukee County. So we will be doing some tree planting within that forested area, but as well as outside. So for the larger property, if you recall back to the master plan, I mentioned we will be doing a significant amount of tree planting to connect the wooded Cedar Gorge to the north with this 40-acre property to the south, so that we have a contiguous forested area connecting that, so that it's a contiguous forest ultimately. So, and there will be, as I mentioned, planting specifically within the community forest and within the existing forest land.
All right, so the next question is about the beach, so the shoreline area. One of the pictures, so the picture we had of the clay bluffs in the presentation didn't really show a ton of beach. Is there more beach where the lake access is planned on the north side of the preserve?
Good question. The width of the beach changes with the lake levels. We just went through a period of historic high Lake Michigan water levels, and which are now receding. So we are seeing a little bit more increased beach. The beach, for those of you that have any familiarity with Lion's Den Gorge, is very similar. So there is some shoreline, some beach frontage, if you will. It is wider now than it was probably a year or two ago, but it does largely depend on the lake levels. It has been as high as the toe of the bluff on the property. One other interesting feature is there is on the north end of the property, there is a bedrock outcropping in the lake that does provide a little bit of break for the wave energy. And so again, generally speaking, there is some shoreline, some beach, but it does largely depend on those lake levels. The access, the reason for the location of the access is really because of the unstable clay bluff in a lot of the on a lot of the property. So the most suitable area for providing that access is through the gorge. While extremely challenging still, that is the most suitable area, as we've done at Lion's Den Gorge. So similar access is envisioned, but that's why the location on the north end of the property, because that is right now identified as the best area for access to the beach.
And this is kind of a perfect segue into the next question. So how stable are the bluffs? Are they more or less prone to erosion than other bluff areas along the lake?
Another great question. There's been a lot of study of the bluffs throughout Ozaukee County and southeast Wisconsin. The area immediately south of Port Washington, this area where Clay Bluffs Cedar Gorge Nature Preserve is, does have an average kind of recession rate of the bluff of about 2 feet per year. That is, I would say, moderate to high throughout Ozaukee County, that type of recession. There are portions of the property that are somewhat sheltered from that. As I mentioned, there's a bedrock outcropping in Lake Michigan on the north end of the property, which limits some of the bluff and toe erosion. But in general, these bluffs are, I would say, moderately unstable in this part of the county, based on what we've seen with historic recession rates.
All right, we do have a few more questions, and if anyone needs any more clarifying points to the questions we've already gone through, feel free to put them in the chat, or when we're done with this, turn your mic off and ask us. We want to make sure we get these answered. So the next question is, how pervasive is the ash borer issue? What % of the forest is dead ash trees? And do we have a list of the varieties of trees that we're going to be planting? And will this be published? And will it include conifers as well as deciduous trees? Andrew, let me know if you want me to repeat any of that.
Yeah, a lot of really good questions.
Mm-hmm.
So emerald ash borer is fairly pervasive. So for those of you that have been following emerald ash borer at all, it was actually first identified in Ozaukee County, the first in the state of Wisconsin. So we have been dealing with emerald ash borer since 2008. And so we have seen a lot of the damage occur and have lost many of our ash trees. We don't have a really tight number on the percentage of ash trees in the community forest or on the property at this point. Part of what we hope to do, which I didn't, I think, explicitly mention, but part of our work in 2023 will be doing some inventory work. So it'll be getting a better inventory of the percentage of ash and also the diversity of tree species on the community forest land. We have had some initial inventories completed by the Regional Planning Commission, Sewer PAC. We have also done some initial inventory, but a more comprehensive inventory would need to be done to answer that. I would just generally say that in that community forest area of the 42 acres, I would say that there are a high percentage of ash because that forest was largely comprised of wooded wetlands, and ash was one of our most common species that was a keystone species for our wooded wetlands. So I would say that there's, probably a good chance of, over 50% of the tree composition being ash, and which is why we want to plant a diversity of trees going forward. So to answer that next question, yes, we have a species list that we have been using throughout the county, native trees only, native to this area and specifically to the Lake Michigan community coastal forests. Those are in the plan, and you can see those. I had them in the PowerPoint as well. So if you want to revisit the recorded version, there's a listing of the species. It's about 20 or so of tree species, and then at least a dozen or so shrub species as well, native to the area and also native to these forested wetlands. So that will be published. As far as the mix of conifer and deciduous, there are both. I will say native to Ozaukee County, though, there are very few native conifers to Ozaukee County. The key ones being tamarack, cedar, white pine, particularly for the Lake Michigan coastal forest. So those for conifer species will largely be sticking with those natives, but there will be a mix of both.
Okay, so the next question has to do with the existing farmland. So since some of the land has been farmed for years, do you have to do anything to restore the soil, or is that what the rye planting does?
Great question. So yes, the land, a good portion of the land, 80 acres approximately, has been marginal farmland to this point. Yes, one of the first steps that we're doing is getting that cover crop on the annual rye to start to restore that. So I would say a good majority of the open farmland area is going to be restored to open emergent wetlands and also native prairie. So we will be working towards restoring that soil, but part of it is keeping a cover crop on it until we can do kind of the targeted restoration for a given acreage. So as we move towards restoring some of it to either wetland or native prairie, we'll be making sure that we keep an active cover crop on it to start healing and restoring those soils. And ultimately, we hope for great success. Like I said, there will be a mix, but native prairie, wetland, and forest that will be restored throughout that farmland acreage.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, we have two more questions. So within the 42-acre existing forest tract, there is a juniper scrub area, which I saw is designated as potentially restorable wetland. I'm curious if that plant community is a native ecotype and will be preserved, or if it is a novel ecotype and will be restored to a different plant community.
Really great question. It is a native ecotype, and that's where kind of the idea of do no harm first. So where you saw potentially restorable wetlands within the existing forested area, if it as additional survey and inventory work is conducted, if it doesn't make sense to do restoration in those areas, in other words, the community that exists is both native and in good condition, we won't be doing that. And subsequently, those areas that have been largely degraded and disturbed, the farmland areas, we do have, goals for wetland restoration there to try and reestablish some of those native ecotypes. But yes, that juniper scrub habitat, wetland habitat is a native ecotype for this, and it's somewhat unique to those coastal bluff top wetlands.
Okay, the final question in the chat is, does the list of trees include more southern species to plan for climate change?
Yeah, we will have some species well vetted. We want to be careful to not introduce anything that might have invasive tendencies. That's not to say that it's an invasive species, but there are some southern species that may have more invasive tendencies to spread and so forth. So in a well thought out way, we do plan to work towards the introduction of some tree species that are have a more southern range and can kind of adjust for climate change. And that is a good point also for the wetland restoration work that we hope to do. So there will be some species that address that need, but we'll do it very carefully so as to avoid anything that would disturb the natural community.
Thank you everyone for these great questions. I think if there's any more questions, feel free to turn your mute off or type them in the chat. We'll stick around for a couple minutes, and Andrew, if you have any closing remarks, but thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Aunt Natalie said. Thank you everybody for these really great questions. Again, please, if you have a chance, download the plan and give us any comments you might have on the specifics. You can see some of your questions will be addressed further with that final plan draft. But again, thank you for your time tonight. We will also have this recording, so if there's others that couldn't make it tonight, we hope to post this recorded presentation on our website, as well as where the final draft is. So again, thanks so much for the great questions tonight, and we encourage any comments. Thank you. And we will stick around for a little bit here, but for those of you, this is the end of the formal program, but if anybody has any questions, we will stick around for a few minutes yet.